Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.
Okay, thank you. Well, assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone. I'm just going to try to set this up. Normally I do it through the slides, through the actual program, so I'm going to see if I can get this thing to now allow me to set it up. Whoops, there we go. Alright, so let's get started. When we hear the word vertigo, for many of us there is a very clear image that comes to mind. And that image is of that scene from the famous Alfred Hitchcock film Vertigo, where we see Jimmy Stewart's character climbing up that stairwell inside a bell tower. And when he looks down, he sees the stairs and the floor below suddenly pulling away from him out into the distance. Now, this visual effect in this scene has become so memorable and iconic that this filming technique has earned the nickname the vertigo zoom. Of course, the truth is that vertigo is not as obvious a perceptual phenomenon that this film leads us to believe, nor is it a true reflection of what it's really like to experience vertigo. What vertigo really feels like is this form of dizziness that one experiences because of this manifestation of an illusion of motion. In other words, what happens is when we experience vertigo is that our brain sends us these false signals informing us that we are moving in a certain direction when in fact we're not. And it's a perceptual phenomenon that's well known in the aviation industry, where it's also referred to as spatial disorientation, where a pilot's sense of direction is in conflict with what their instrument panel and even what their other senses are telling them is really going on. And a good example to help us better understand what this looks like is to look at the crash of the John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, what caused John F. Kennedy Jr. to crash his plane was this phenomenon of vertigo, where his brain convinced him that he was flying in a straight path, when in fact he was actually flying his plane in a downward direction towards the ocean floor. And it's important to note here that these false signals being sent from our brain are so powerful that even though the gauges in his plane were clearly pointing out the downward angle his plane was taking, he was nonetheless convinced that he was in fact flying straight and consequently made no effort to alter his flight path. And while John F. Kennedy Jr.'s accident is certainly one of the more well-known examples of a plane crash occurring because of vertigo, this phenomenon is actually quite common and a very costly problem for aviation organizations, some of whom spend almost $1 million a day to cover losses incurred due to plane crashes caused by pilots suffering from vertigo. So we can see that vertigo is a powerful perceptual phenomenon because it can very easily override what information we're getting from other senses or other information sources about what's really going on around us. In fact, in speaking with one pilot about his own personal experience with a bout of vertigo, he recalled how convinced he was about flying straight and level that even though his gauges and eyes were telling him something different, he just couldn't reconcile this gap between what his brain was telling him and what his gauge were informing him about what he was doing in flying his plane. Okay, so now that we have a clear understanding of what vertigo is, of how common this affliction is, and of how powerful this phenomenon is in distorting how we experience or understand motion, let's now take a look at what is leadership vertigo. Now, if we work off our understanding now of what vertigo really is, leadership vertigo essentially refers to the gap that exists between how we view our leadership and how those under our care experience our leadership. It refers to those moments where we convince ourselves that things are moving along as they should when in fact they're not. Of course, like pilots who suffer from vertigo, it's not easy for us to know or to convince ourselves of the existence of this gap between what we think we're doing and what we're actually doing. This is why, despite all those numerous studies and books that tell us how we can be a better leader for our team and organization, we continue to see these stagnant, low levels of employee engagement in organizations around the world. It's not simply because we have leaders who don't care or who lack the ability to lead others. Rather, in most cases, it's because of this gap created through Leadership Vertigo, where leaders believe they are in fact creating the best conditions for their organizational success. And yet, if you ask their employees, they say that the conditions in the workplace are anything but. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of what is Leadership Vertigo, and we can see the impact it has on our leadership and the success of organization, how do we go about overcoming these bouts of leadership vertigo that all of us are susceptible to experiencing? Well, what we need to do is employ what I call in my book the 4 leadership principles. And the 4 leadership principles are: build community, develop competence, earn credibility, and cultivate compassion. Now, the way I want you to think of these is that they're like landmarks on your leadership landscape. They're the things you're going to use to help you make sure that you are in fact creating the kind of conditions your employees and organization requires to succeed and thrive in today's fast-changing global environment. Although I'll be focusing in today's talk on the first and last leadership principles, those of build community and cultivate compassion, I'd like to briefly go over the other 2 leadership principles because, as we can see from this illustration, each of these 4 leadership principles are interconnected. They're not standalone concepts, but they're pieces of this bigger puzzle that, when we put them together, allow us to be the kind of leader our employees need us to be. Now, the second leadership principle, develop competence, refers to how we show up in those daily interactions with those we lead. Are we going into those meetings, those conversations we have with our employees as we walk around our workplace with a genuine interest to learn and understand what they have to say? And how is our current emotional state coloring how we interpret and respond to what our employees are telling us? Do our words and nonverbal cues line up, or are they out of sync because we're not truly present in that conversation? It's important to note here that research has shown that our emotions are very contagious and that our brains are hardwired to pick up on those nonverbal cues we give up before we even say a word. So the minute you walk into that meeting room, your team members have already read those nonverbal cues you're giving off, and everything you say and do is going to be filtered through that initial perception that they got about your emotional state. And this is also why we're seeing today so much being discussed about emotional intelligence and leadership, because when we talk about competence, we can't talk about just our technical competencies, but we also got to talk about this emotional component that we are, again, hardwired to read off. So it is becoming now very critical, because now that we've mastered a lot of the technical competencies, the main driving force for us to encourage growth and innovation and success is now coming off of our ability to understand the emotional component we bring to our leadership. Now, the third leadership principle, earn credibility, looks at something that we're also seeing more and more in discussions about leadership today. And that is specifically, how do we go about increasing our awareness, both of our own mental state as well as of the realities those around us face? What's critical to this principle is being open with our employees that we don't have all the answers, because only then can we free ourselves to be genuine about what it is that we're after, what it is we need, and what we can actually provide them with to be successful in their efforts. Now, before I begin our discussion of the 2 leadership principles that serve as the basis to today's talk, I want to point out that the goal in applying these leadership principles is not to put your focus on what you're doing wrong. Rather, it's to ensure that your focus is on how you can do a better job leading your employees by making appropriate adjustments in how you lead, so you can create that kind of environment that drives organizational success for many years to come. And this lines up with the findings of the Towers-Watson Global Workforce Study, which found that employees now have higher expectations for those in management positions to demonstrate the ability to be more effective in leading people than in simply managing tasks. So with that in mind, let's now look at the first leadership principle, build community. Now, the reason why this is the first leadership principle we need to make sure we're employing through our leadership to overcome those bouts of leadership vertigo is because it's directly tied to one of the three core psychological needs that research has shown by Richard M. Dacey and Edward L. Ryan that we all have, irrespective of our nationality, culture, creed, or other differentiating factor. And this core psychological need is relatedness. That each of us has this need to feel a sense of belonging, a sense of connectedness, both to the people around us and to the work we do. In terms of addressing leadership vertigo, this is critical because it will ensure that we are in fact creating an environment where our employees feel valued and that they understand why their work matters and the value it creates both for themselves and for those around them. So how do we go about building this sense of community in our organization? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to create opportunities for our employees to be able to interact with other employees from different teams and departments. And a great example of a successful company that employs this tactic is Pixar. Now, the image you see here is, in fact, the main lobby area of the Pixar campus. And it was specifically designed by then Chairman and CEO Steve Jobs to be one of the common meeting spaces for all of the organization's employees so that it would facilitate these sparks of creativity and inspiration. The idea here being that employees would be encouraged to intermingle so as to be exposed to different ideas, outlooks, and experiences, which could then help them to inform the ideas and measures they put into action. For example, a purchasing manager could share stories of things their child said or did that are reflective of the childlike wonder that's become a hallmark of Pixar's most successful films. Or perhaps a computer programmer was able to share a fond childhood memory of exploring this far-off imaginary world that helped to inspire the backdrop used to tell an upcoming story on film. By creating an environment where employees from various departments could connect, communicate, and engage, Pixar's leadership was able to provide their employees with the kinds of insights and experiences that have helped to make their movies so magical and beloved by people of all ages. Indeed, many cite that this interconnected atmosphere that's found in the Pixar workplace as being part of the reason why they continue to create such amazing movies that resonate with both children and adults alike. Likewise, in your organization, it's important that you encourage and facilitate your employees to get outside of their respective groups and teams and engage with others in your organization so they can not only better appreciate the different perspectives and experiences found in your organization, but also how there is this underlying shared purpose that connects and drives your collective efforts. Another important benefit this will provide is ensuring that the internal competition spurs on collaboration instead of internal silos. Given how many of us are now having to operate with limited time and resources, it's very easy to engender a scarcity mindset, one where we see any progress in our organization as a zero-sum game in which one team or department's win comes at the expense of another team's loss. But by encouraging your employees to step outside of their formal roles, to interact and engage with others, you can tap into this core psychological need for relatedness, where your employees will no longer see each other as a threat to your organization's limited resources, but as part of a larger group driven to achieve the same end goal. The second strategy we need to employ to build community in our organization is to make sure that we don't lose sight of the journey we've taken up to this point. And this strategy is particularly important for us to take note of in light of both the growing demands on our time, attention, and resources, as well as in light of the faster pace at which we now have to operate. And by this I mean that in our current rush to get things done, it's becoming easier for us to quickly gloss over an event, whether it's good or bad, in favor of focusing on the next flashing light on your screen demanding your attention. This kind of behavior is well represented on various social media platforms where a topic or a public gaffe can become this viral event, which within days or even hours is soon forgotten as people have moved on to the next attention-grabbing topic. And a good example that we can see of why it's important for us to keep sight of the journey we've taken to get where we are is the historic landing of the Philae space probe on a comet last November. While the world joined the various scientists from the European Space Agency in celebrating this historic milestone event in space exploration, through the interviews with the various scientists involved in this project, we learned of the numerous challenges and obstacles they had to overcome to attain this goal. As such, while we might have been celebrating this moment for its historic implications, many of these scientists were also celebrating how it represented a victory for how they worked together to overcome all the obstacles that stood before them in making their shared vision reality. That's why it's important that we make time to not only celebrate the successes and achievements we attain, but to also note the challenges we had to overcome and what we can learn from them. Because remember that as much as we might like to be defined by our successes, we are also a product of our failures. And this is an important lesson for all leaders to take note of. That while it is critical to make time to celebrate the successes and achievements you attain, it is equally important that you not overlook the lessons learned in having to address the various challenges that stood in your way. And with that, let's now look at the final strategy that we need to employ to build a sense of community in our organization. And that is that we have to make sure that we're promoting a sense of shared ownership among our employees in the collective vision that defines why we do what we do. Now, if we look at both Pixar and the European Space Agency, although they differ vastly in terms of the kind of work and objectives that drive their collective efforts, one thing they do share in common is how in both organizations there is this undeniable sense of shared ownership among its numerous employees for their organization's vision. If you look at any interview or behind-the-scenes documentary with anyone who works at these organizations, what's clear is that what mattered to them is not their individual contributions, but how those efforts they made were tied to this bigger purpose, this bigger vision that connected their collective efforts together. And this sense of shared ownership among their employees is a critical keystone to their organization's successes, because in both cases, their employees are working on a project, be it the next animation film or a new space probe, where they have to wait years before they'll know if their efforts and contributions have created something of value. We have to remember that people want to be a part of something bigger than themselves, to know that what they do matters and create something valuable. And before you think that this is something that is dependent on the kind of work we do, I want to briefly share the results of one study that found that people experience their work in one of three ways: as a job, as a career, and as a calling. Now, if you're a doctor or a firefighter, it's easy for us to see why you'd view your work as a calling. But what about the rest of us? Is it possible for us to also feel like the work we do is our calling? Well, these same researchers asked themselves this question, and they looked for the answer in researching the attitude and behaviors of hospital cleaners. Now, not surprisingly, 1/3 of these hospital cleaners that they researched said that they did view their work as just a job, while another third said they viewed it as a career. But here's where things get interesting. The remaining third of hospital cleaners said they viewed their work as a calling. And these hospital cleaners, when compared to their colleagues, were found to be more engaging with hospital staff and patients, They took initiatives to improve how they approached their work, and they brought more energy and creativity to their role in these hospitals. And this is exactly what creating this sense of shared ownership in your organization's shared purpose or vision creates. It empowers your employees to feel that sense of pride and accomplishment in knowing that they're helping to make a difference and do something that few could achieve. And to further convince you of the power of this, to show you what it looks like to engender this sense of shared ownership in the larger goal or vision that defines why your organization does what it does, just take a look at the people featured on this slide. This is a picture that was taken of some of the members of the Philae scientific team when they got back those first signals telling them their probe had successfully landed on a comet. Wouldn't you love to experience this kind of elation in your workplace? Wouldn't you love to be the kind of leader that creates these kinds of moments for your employees? Pixar and the European Space Agency have shown us that in keeping the leadership principle, build community, in our line of sight as we navigate our organization forward, we can in fact accomplish such through our leadership, because it reminds us that the only way we can get our employees to care about our vision, to care about our objectives and goals, is by creating that kind of workplace environment where our employees see that we care about what matters to them as well, that we care about their hopes and dreams, their ambitions, and what drives them to press ahead, so we can create that sense of belonging and connectedness that's tied to that core psychological need we all possess and need to have fulfilled. Okay, so we've gone through the 3 strategies we need to employ to build community in our organization, which will help us to ensure that we are keeping that gap between how we view our leadership and how those around us experience it small, because we're engendering now this outward focus on our employees. So now I'd like to look at the 4th leadership principle from my book, that of cultivating compassion, so we can understand how this leadership principle can help us to address those bouts of leadership vertigo that we will all experience at one point or another. Now, to help explain how this leadership principle can help us to address that gap leadership vertigo creates between how we view our leadership and how those around us experience it, we need to look at 2 behaviors that we're all hardwired to experience and exhibit. The first one is that research has shown that we're all hardwired to empathize with those around us, especially with those who we feel a powerful connection with, something that ties with the leadership principle we just looked at regarding the importance of building a sense of community in your organization. And it doesn't take much for us to recognize the truth of this, because we've seen on numerous occasions how much we're emotionally impacted or invested in events or situations that happen anywhere in the world, even though we may not have any personal or familial connections in that setting. The second behavior we're all hardwired to demonstrate is a sense of curiosity. Now, if you're a parent, this is something you've no doubt been reminded of in how much your children are eager to understand why things are the way they are, not to mention why they can't have a cookie before dinner, since adults seem to have an unending appetite that requires dieting plans and exercise to overcome. Now, no matter what our personal or professional experiences, these 2 characteristics of empathy and curiosity remain within us. The only difference being, how much are we exercising them in our everyday work lives? And this is where the leadership principle, cultivate compassion, comes into play, because our sense of compassion arises from our innate drive to listen and learn from those around us, along with that drive to help make a difference and improve things. By cultivating our compassion, we can create this environment where we inspire and enable those around us to bring their best selves to the table, because we have that focal point to ensure that we're not making our leadership about us, but about those under our care. In fact, research by Barsad and O'Neill has shown recently that organizations that exhibit a culture of compassion had higher levels of employee satisfaction, commitment, and personal accountability, and this proved true across a wide range of industries and fields. This is why exhibiting compassion through our leadership is becoming a critical piece to organizational success in today's fast-paced, interconnected global environment. Our sense of compassion allows us to shift our focus away from ourselves, from focusing on the internal narrative we tell ourselves about our leadership, and focus instead on what we need to do to help those we lead achieve the goals we set out for them. And this is exactly how employing this leadership principle can help us to overcome those bouts of leadership vertigo. So with that, I'd like to now share with you 3 strategies to help you cultivate compassion in your leadership. And the first one is to learn to see your employees beyond the roles or tasks they play in your organization. In light of today's faster-paced 24/7 global environment with its numerous social and communication channels that we have to deal with, it's easy for us to fall into that trap of focusing solely on what we want to accomplish or on what would help us to take more things off of our own to-do lists. The problem with this, though, is that it will leave our employees feeling like more of a means to an end than valued contributors to our shared purpose. And this will not only make them care less about our vision, it'll make them less inclined to commit their discretionary efforts to your shared purpose. What we need to do to counterbalance this is to discover what matters to our employees. We need to nurture relationships with them that will help us to understand what they hope to accomplish in their roles in our organization. What will make them feel like they're contributing in a meaningful fashion? And then how can we connect that with the shared purpose that defines our organization's vision and long-term goals? And all these efforts tie into that core psychological need of relatedness that I discussed earlier, because what we're doing here is helping our employees to not simply view themselves in terms of their roles or functions, but as valued members of our community. That we want them to have a sense of shared ownership in what we collectively do and in the vision we have for our organization. Another benefit of employing this tactic is that it will help to ensure that we're not simply relying on external factors to motivate our employees. Several studies have demonstrated that external motivating factors like bonuses and perks only motivate over a short period, and that it's internal motivating factors like a sense of purpose, of doing meaningful work, and seeing the value in that work that drives sustainable employee engagement and motivation over the long term. But what research has also shown is that it's the nature and not the level of motivation that's the key to driving that sustainable motivating behaviors in those you lead. Studies have shown that when the nature of an employee's motivation is internally based, that the focus is on purpose-driven and meaningful work, work that employees can see for themselves and understand for themselves why it's important. They don't require others to demonstrate to them. They get it themselves. Employees exhibit now higher levels of self-esteem as well as lower stress levels. Conversely, when an employee's motivation is based on those external factors, such as prestige or financial rewards, employees do in fact exhibit lower levels of self-esteem as well as higher stress levels. Additionally, studies have also shown that when employees are internally motivated by what they do at work, they demonstrate higher levels of creativity, persistence, and performance than those that require that external motivator to drive what they do. In other words, by moving beyond simply seeing our employees in terms of the tasks they perform and understanding what matters to them, what would make them feel like they're making a difference, and then giving them opportunities to do work that matters, we can create this self-driving force in our employees and in our organization that will help to fuel employee productivity and organizational growth. That's why I love this quote here from Tony Hsieh, because it's a great reminder of how important it is to see our employees as more than just what they do, so we can in fact tap into their talents, creativity, and insights and help direct it towards our shared purpose. The next strategy we need to use to cultivate compassion in our leadership is to understand what are the real strengths of your employees. Now, most of us understand that the value of focusing on building on our strengths instead of trying to continually compensate for our weaknesses. But how many of us are aware of what our employees' strengths really are, as opposed to what we see them being good at? As this quote from Marcus Buckingham points out, our strengths are not simply what we're good at. Rather, it's what strengthens us. It's those things that make us feel like we're contributing in a meaningful fashion, that we're making a difference. If we are to help our employees to succeed, we have to understand what our employees' real strengths are, and armed with this new insight, provide them with opportunities to stretch those competencies to facilitate their growth, to feel empowered in the work they do, and help them become more valued contributors to our shared purpose. This is where our innate sense of empathy and curiosity come into play, because we can use these behaviors to dig deeper into understanding what ignites that internal drive in our employees to challenge themselves, to push themselves to do more, to be more than they are today. And then, armed with these new insights, provide our employees with new opportunities to stretch and grow these newly defined competencies. And that means that we need to not only give our employees the authority to do their job, but we also have to delegate responsibility to them with support and guidance so that they can build and expand their knowledge and experiences. Of course, to do such in a compassionate fashion, one where we're tapping into both our sense of empathy and curiosity, means we can't simply assign new tasks or responsibilities without replacing existing ones, as this can not only lead to employee burnout, but also confusion as to what really matters to your organization's shared purpose and long-term growth. So consequently, what we need to do to tap into our sense of curiosity, so we can ask ourselves the following three questions. Number one, what do we need to continue doing? Number two, what do we need to stop doing? And number three, what do we need to do differently moving forward? By making time to ask these questions, we'll be showing our employees that, going back to my first strategy, we're now seeing them as whole individuals, and not simply in terms of the tasks they perform in our organization, because we're committed to understanding what they need to do to feel like their work matters, as well as coming to a better understanding of the realities they face in our organization. This will also help you to better understand what your employees' real strengths are, because you're now making time to articulate and define not only the what, but the why behind the various new measures you need to employ, which will help to ensure that you're putting these into action not because of a reactive reflex, but from a responsive, reflective one. And finally, the last strategy I want to share with you on how you can cultivate compassion in your leadership is to be open and honest with your employees that you don't have all the answers. And again, here to help us appreciate the importance and value of this strategy, I'd like to share the following story with you. Now, I'm sure many of you might recognize that the man in these two photos is none other than Walt Disney. And Walt had a saying he used to tell his employees in the years following the opening of Disneyland in California, and that was he wanted them to keep plussing the show. And by that, what he meant was he didn't want people to think that just because a ride or an attraction had been built and in service for some time, that it didn't mean that there wasn't something that they could do to improve the experience for their guests. And to demonstrate his commitment to this vision, to this idea that they could keep plussing the show, Walt would regularly leave his office at the fire station at Disneyland at all hours of the day so he could walk the park to interact with both the guests and his employees. And even as we can see on the photo on the left, he would also at times go on some of the rides themselves so he could get this first-hand experience to understand what it was like for his park guests coming to visit his park. Now, on one of these walks, Walt came along the ride operator for the Skyway gondolas, which you could see in the picture on the right. And Walt goes up to the ride operator and he asks to speak to his employee for a minute. And Walt Disney tells this ride operator that they're thinking of updating the Skyway ride. And he tells the ride operator, "You work on this attraction every day, so I can't think of anyone more qualified to give me ideas for the new design." Now, what's interesting about this exchange is that this ride operator is only 18 years old, and here is none other than Walt Disney asking this teenager what he thinks should be done to improve a ride that Walt Disney oversaw the design and installation of. So, naturally, this ride operator is both surprised and nervous to be giving Walt Disney advice on how to improve his ride. But after a moment, he replies, "Actually, the gondola roofs are too low, and the guests often bump their heads when I load and unload them off the ride." So Walt Disney lists to this young ride operator. He shares some of his experiences and stories of what it's like, operating this ride and the experiences the guests have using it. And after they exchange their ideas, Walt thanks the ride operator for his input, and then he goes to board one of the gondolas. And, yep, you guessed it, Walt Disney bumped his head on the roof of the gondola. In our rush to get things done, it can be tempting for us to simply supply what we think are the best solutions to a given problem or situation, and then simply leave it up to our employees to just carry out our decision or our solution to that problem. However, the reason I wanted to share this story with you is because it reminds us that we can't assume that those at the top have a clear understanding of all the intricacies that need to be addressed in a given situation, especially when one takes into account the increasing complexity and faster pace of today's global market. And that's why I like this example from Walt Disney, because it exemplifies how a leader can look to their employees for their insights and experiences to help us make the right decisions, which can help us then to build and sustain those relationships with those we lead, because we're showing them that they are valued and important members of our community. And this brings us back to that reality of how we will all experience leadership vertigo, where we'll be convinced that how we view our leadership is the same as how those we lead experience it, and how employing leadership principles like cultivate compassion by drawing on our innate sense of empathy and curiosity, as Walt Disney did in this story, we can in fact create those conditions through our leadership that will drive organizational success for many years to come, because we're creating these open lines of communication through which our employees can share their insights and experiences as they know they are seen as being critical to their organization's growth and prosperity. Oh, and by the way, after speaking with that 18-year-old ride operator, the newly redesigned gondolas did in fact have higher roofs, and that 18-year-old ride operator went on in time to become the corporate director at Disney University. Okay, so I know we covered a fair amount, even though we touched only on 2 of the leadership principles I write about in my first leadership book, but I want to bring us back full circle to this image of those 4 leadership principles to remind you again that these aren't standalone principles, but rather, as we saw through our discussion of the last leadership principle, they are very much integrated and interdependent, and that we have to ensure that we keep each of these leadership principles on our leadership radar to ensure that we are, in fact, being the kind of leader our employees require in order to succeed and thrive. Indeed, if we look back at the last leadership principle we discussed of cultivating compassion, we can now appreciate how it's tied to the leadership principle develop competence and how we have to improve our understanding of how our own energy and emotional state can impact not only how we perceive things, of how we demonstrate a sense of caring and concern for those around us, but also how our actions and words promote that sense of curiosity that will compel those we lead to share with us their experiences and insights of what it's like to work in our organization. Similarly, when we were discussing the leadership principle build community and how we can foster that sense of belonging in our organization among our employees, we can now appreciate how it's tied to that leadership principle of develop competence and how we can, in order to increase our awareness of the challenges and opportunities our employees face, we can better understand what it is that they require to feel like valued members of our community, as well as the fact that using that principle of develop competence can help us to truly listen to what they tell us so we can in fact understand better what matters to them, what it is that they care about, and what would make them feel like they are doing meaningful work, and then allowing them to feel that sense of connectedness both to the work they do and to each other. And that's why I want to point out that what's key for us to address those bouts of leadership vertigo that we will all experience at one point or another is to make sure that we mind the gap between how we view our leadership and how those around us experience working under our leadership, recognizing that most times this gap will be rather small. But if we don't pay attention to it, it can grow into something a lot more significant and adversely impactful in terms of the kinds of achievements we want to create through our leadership. Ultimately, the goal here in helping you to understand what is leadership vertigo and that all of us are susceptible to experiencing it is to help you understand that no matter how well we think we may be doing, there is always the opportunity and even at times the need for us to step up and push ourselves to do better, to become that better version of ourselves so we can in fact help those around us, along with ourselves, to succeed and thrive in today's increasingly competitive business landscape. And that's why I wanted to share these 6 strategies for how we can build a sense of community and organization and cultivate our compassion so we can in fact do work that not only matters, but creates that sense of purpose and meaning that drives all of us to keep pressing ahead. And with that, I'd like to leave you with some ways to connect with me to learn more about this and my other writings on insights on leadership. And a good place to start is by reading my award-winning leadership blog on my website at tanveernaseer.com. And as Mr. Jafari pointed out, I'm also very active on Twitter, and you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @Tanveer Naseer. I also invite you to reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. There's the address to my LinkedIn profile. And of course, if you have any questions or comments or would like to know more about my work, please feel free to email me at my email address seen on the screen right now. And obviously at the end too, you're more than welcome to check out my book, Leadership Vertigo, which you can buy online and is found also in stores. And with that, I'd like to conclude our talk. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I'd like to now pass it over to Mr. Jafari to begin the question and answer period of today's webinar.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Naseer, for a very interesting presentation. And folks, now we are open for the question and answer. So if you have any questions, you can put it in the question box, or you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your console. So if you click on it, you can speak to the speaker as well. So let me go to the question box. There are a couple of interesting questions already posted. The first one, why do you think leaders normally tend to forget about leading with hearts and to serve, and instead, most of them are seemingly interested only to rule?
That's a good question. Well, I think one thing that we do have to acknowledge is, again, here's another study that was done, I think, about a year ago, where they were looking at what are the factors that organizations use to move people up into leadership positions? And unfortunately right now, there is still a prevalence towards promoting people up into a leadership position based on technical performance and not on terms of having the capabilities or competencies to effectively lead. So I think that's why a lot of people walk into leadership looking at it more as a task-oriented process, which is why they come off looking like they're more interested in ruling than actually leading. And this is why, again, we see so much being discussed now about our emotional competencies, because clearly to get to a leadership position, we've demonstrated we have the technical proficiencies. We understand this. The challenge is, do we now understand how do we tap into the innate talents, creativity, insights of those we lead, so that we're not having just one person's insights and decision-making competencies being used, but those of everybody, so we are, in fact, making the best decisions. So I think that's one key issue, that in many organizations we're still promoting people and not providing them with the proper tools and resources to be great leaders. The other challenge I've been noticing, especially in the past year, is the increasing pace at which things have to be addressed and concerned, and the increasing number of channels, and also now the growing expectations. Now it's becoming more clear, as I mentioned in my talk, where people employees are making it very clear that they have higher expectations for leaders to be leading people and not simply managing tasks, to be, as you said, leading with heart and not being interested in ruling. And the problem I've noticed is that a lot of leaders now are finding that there's greater demands on their time and attention, and so there is that propensity to just want to get things done. And so consequently, employees end up looking like more of a means to an end rather than, well, how do I get you engaged in this process? So I think that's, again, one of the reasons why we have to be very attentive, because that reality is not going to change. If anything, it's going to get worse because our demands for our time are going to keep getting higher. So we really got to keep these ideas on the radar, for example, of seeing our employees beyond those simple, well, if I give it to this person, this task, they're going to help me get that off my to-do list. We have to really understand that this is an individual and how do we connect it to what matters to them. And I've had leaders express, well, that's a tall order, but they have to realize, well, that's leadership, especially in today's world.
Okay, we have one short question from Brother Moeed. The question is, what is the best tool to measure leadership performance?
That's a good. I think the best thing is you have to look at the, I would say, productivity levels of your employees, because if your employees are not, I'll give an example. I just recently shared the story of one leader who he was part of this team, which is a very successful, well-operating group of people, and he got promoted again because of his technical proficiencies and also because he was one of the more senior members of the organization. So I think this was a ploy to kind of keep him in the organization and not lose that talent. The problem is that he's not a leader material. He doesn't understand what it requires to lead. And so he became very much interested in, this is how I like to operate, so now this is how everyone else is going to have to operate. And so what happened over time is that they know it's not a very long period too, I might add. It was really just a period of a year. The organization started noticing how quickly productivity and even morale, which is a bit harder to gauge, but productivity is very easy to measure, was very quickly going down in terms of the output the employees are putting out, but also in terms of their ability to address issues. Before, they were very creative, very much coming up with various different solutions, and then suddenly it whittled down that they were only coming up with one or two ideas. And then they soon began to realize that the key change that happened in that team was a change in leadership. And then in discussing with employees, they realized what the problem was. A lot of them felt like they had been working in a team where everyone was an equal owner in that team's efforts, to now being, well, we're just here to do stuff to make him look good. And so he didn't last very long because of that, and because of the fact that they used that metric of looking at the productivity levels. A lot of companies will tend to look at more things like profit and losses and so forth, but those can be kind of played with. But productivity is very hard to work around because it's very easy to discern a decline in productivity and output from a group of employees. And it's frankly the most obvious connector between a leader's guidance and its employees, because your finances are really dependent on the market. And so you can have changes in your market in another setting that can impact other areas. And so suddenly you're having a loss in income or a loss in revenues, which might not necessarily be reflective of your leadership, but what will be reflective of your leadership is how you respond to that and keep your employees engaged. And that's something that's directly correlated to your leadership competencies.
Okay, thank you. We have one last question. It's an interesting one. As professional envyism is increasing in the age of information, what about mediation skills in leaders to facilitate knowledge sharing, ensure stakeholders' ownership, and foster innovation?
Yeah, that is really important. I mean, and that obviously connects to that idea of cultivating compassion, because what we're doing there then is, when you're talking about mediation and stuff, it's not meant to be this a zero-sum game where I come out of this winning and you losing, or you win and I lose. And a great example of that actually is Nelson Mandela. What made him succeed in bringing about the end to apartheid was not the fact that he was able to rally the world against apartheid. The world was pretty much against apartheid. He realized the key was not to shame the white government that was basically running the apartheid system in South Africa. What he just realized instead is I have to make you come out of this negotiation as much a winner as I am. So he always went into those negotiations and to mediate from the assumption of, well, look, we need to come out of here with something where we both feel like we're getting something of value, that we're respecting what it is we need to feel like this is what we want from our lives, what we want to achieve, and that we're not coming out feeling like, well, I had to concede this to get that. And the interesting thing, too, that is after his passing, it became revealed that F.W. Clerk, who's the man he helped negotiate an end to apartheid with and who he shared the Nobel Peace Prize that year with, he actually resented that man. And a lot of his friends could not understand why he was very amicable to so many people who were so much more staunch supporters of apartheid, but he really didn't like F.W. de Klerk. And learning about that actually makes him more human, because it makes us realize that even if it's somebody you don't like for whatever reason, there's still an opportunity for us to approach it through leadership, through using our notion of cultivating compassion, where we have using our sense of empathy and curiosity to ensure that we're using mediation to not end up with this zero-sum game where someone has to win and someone has to lose, but where we are using our experiences to help people understand that we can come out of this with both of us gaining something because we're looking at what really matters to us.
Well, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. I would like to thank you, Mr. Naseer, for a very, very interesting presentation. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to point out, I mean, I know I went through, there's like a total of 6 strategies covering 2 different areas. And one of the things I always find is the big issue that a number of leaders have is, how do I go about incorporating new ideas or new strategies in my everyday work? How do I make it native and natural to my flow? And one of the things I always suggest to people is that you have to always look at the list of strategies that you're given and pick the one thing that you feel like you can start doing right away, or maybe you're already kind of doing it but not consistently. And the reason you want to do that is because behavioral change requires us to create new habits. And to do that, we have to take shortcuts, because that's how our brain operates. Our brain likes taking these shortcuts, which is why we create habits. So to utilize any of the strategies I shared today in today's talk, I would suggest find those ones that you know you can start doing right away, because you can see yourself already kind of doing it, but maybe not consistently, and work your way up to the ones that are more challenging, because now you've created that new foundation to help you to actually employ these 6 strategies consistently through your leadership.
Once again, thank you very much, Mr. Naseer. Especially, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship. And thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. We have shared the link from where you can download the soft copy of the presentation. And we are recording this webinar, which will be uploaded on Mile Community. So please stay tuned to webinar.mile.org.
Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.